Okay, so the biggest update that we have is that the government has started issuing these counterfoil-less single entry visas. So when we talked before about what a visa, what a visa was, it was a sort of a stamp that went inside the passport. Now, finally, they are catching on that it is very onerous to have to come and bring your passport or mail your passport in certain countries and get that passport stamp in it and get it back to the individual before they can travel. So while some people are still getting instructions as they shift over to bring their passport in, some people are being issued these counterfoil-less entry visas, which really are just like a document, a letter that allows you to enter the country without that stamp in your passport. And so this is only happening in 6 countries: Poland, Germany, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, and Romania right now. So anybody else is going to go through the normal process, but the idea being that there's less of a backlog in certain visa offices. So if you get the instruction to submit your passport, the requirements right now are that you go forward and you do that. You can't really request this. So if you've already got a request to submit your passport, you go ahead, you follow the directions, but you may get this other letter. So I'm just showing you here. This was a colleague sent to me just so you can have an idea of what this document looks like. This is an actual counterfoil-less visa. So you can see it says counterfoil at the top. And it will have just the one entry. So it's basically just a letter. It's going to tell you to print this out or keep it with you. Page 2. So it's just, you can see there on the bottom, it's just a normal letter. But I wanted you to have a look so that you weren't shocked if somebody got this instead of being asked for their passport. The process would be the same. It'll still apply online like we talked about, but the end of the process may result in just this letter instead of a stamp in the passport. This is a page full of text. And the only reason I'm providing it here is that someone sent this to me, and it was from the Ukrainian settlement helpers in Ottawa. And I thought that it had some interesting tips about buying your ticket and being careful, and you know, about flights to Canada and those types of things. So I'm not going to read through it, but we will provide you with these slides, and it's probably stuff that the Multicultural Association maybe has already provided, but I wanted to make sure that I was sharing it because I thought there was some interesting tips in here for people booking flights and going through this process. So I do just want to go over really quickly what are the requirements that are special because of the pandemic. So in New Brunswick, we've lifted our regulations and restrictions, but federally, so for the border, the Canadian border, there's still all kinds of COVID-19 related requirements, which I'm sure you've looked into, but they can be kind of complicated. So I want to go over them in a little bit more detail than we have in the past. So the major requirement right now is that to enter Canada, unless you fall in a very particular exemption, you need to be vaccinated. But the government has issued an exemption to that rule for Ukrainians and immediate family members. So that means that they are not prohibited from entering Canada because they're not vaccinated. So what does vaccinated mean? It means in most cases 2 doses of the vaccine at least 14 days before your arrival in Canada, or if you've had Johnson & Johnson, it's just the 1 dose 14 days before you arrive in Canada. Children under the age of 5 are not required to be vaccinated. They would be family members of Ukrainians anyways in this case, but just so that you know. So I've got a big long list here of the accepted vaccines, but this is just so you can have it in case someone is wondering if their vaccine falls on the list. These are the ones that are accepted in Canada. So anyone with 2 doses of these, or 1 if it's Johnson & Johnson, would be considered fully vaccinated if it was taken in the appropriate time period. So The next requirement for everyone coming to Canada who is not vaccinated, so this would be a lot of our Ukrainians who maybe don't have the right vaccine, is COVID-19 testing. So there's a requirement that they have a COVID-19 test before they come to Canada. So that can be either an antigen test, but it can't be just a test that you take yourself, like a take-home test, or it's actually a test that you would go and have someone professionally administer. So at like a pharmacy or something like that, they'll give you a documentation of the test, of the negative test. So that's accepted. It has to be taken 1 day before your scheduled flight to Canada, which isn't a long period of time, right? If you have connecting flights. So it's possible that if you have a really long flight or journey to Canada, you might need to arrange a test at one of your sort of stopping sites before you come to Canada. So just be careful because 1 day is not very long. You can also take a PCR test or a molecular test. So that was the original requirement. That test can be taken 72 hours before your scheduled flight to Canada. So it does give you a little bit more leeway. Now, I'm going to note here, because it is coming up because a lot of people have had COVID, that it is possible to, instead of the COVID-19 test, to provide proof of a positive PCR or molecular test taken at least 10 days before you're entering Canada, but no more than 180 days before you're coming to Canada. So you'd start counting the day after you had that test. It has to be a PCR test. It cannot be any kind of even professionally administered antigen test. And you can no longer have symptoms. So this is just to let you know, obviously it's best to have the negative test because it's more straightforward. So people are testing again. But if you have someone, and this is because you can continue to test positive for a really long period of time. So it's an acknowledgement of that. So some people will fall here. Obviously try to get the negative test if you can. Children under the age of 5 do not need to have the test, but 5 and over they do. Unvaccinated travelers will also be given a test to take home. So like a little kit they'll take home, and they'll have a time they'll set up with like a nurse on the computer, and they'll actually do a test and mail it back in on day 8 of their isolation, which we're going to talk about in a minute. People who are vaccinated or unvaccinated can be tested randomly on arrival at the airport. So they'll actually be sent to like a testing little zone in the airport, and they will be given a test. So it's sort of just random. You might be fine, you might not. You might be sent for the test. So just to be aware that that might happen. Quarantine requirements. So adults who are not fully vaccinated under the definition that Canada has created have to isolate or quarantine for 14 days. So that doesn't mean that if you fly into Toronto, you're stuck in Toronto for 14 days. You can go to your final destination, but you have to go as directly as possible to that final destination. So it becomes a question because, as you might know, to get on airplanes in Canada, they're also asking for vaccinations. But if you are allowed into Canada under an exemption, which Ukrainians and their family members are, you can actually get on your connecting flight if it's within 24 hours of your departure flight to Canada. So what we're suggesting is, give yourself a little bit of time in Toronto or Montreal airport, but try to book a flight that's not too far in advance, so that you make sure that you meet those requirements to get on the connecting flight, so you can get to your final destination and quarantine there, and you're not stuck quarantining in another city. So children who are under 5 and are not vaccinated are actually exempt from quarantine. So those are the really little kids. Children between 5 and 11 who are not vaccinated are also exempt from quarantine. And children who are 12 to 17 who are not vaccinated must quarantine. So they'll quarantine with their parents, just like the adults. Just a small note here, the other requirement, of course, that you've probably heard of is to use ArriveCan. I've got a link here, and I just make a note, there are some fake ArriveCan sites, unfortunately. So make sure that people are using, especially if they're not used to using apps in the computer, make sure they're using the right link and that it's the government link. It shouldn't ask you for any money, so it's just free. So a sign that you've got a bad link is that they're asking for a credit card number. That's definitely not required. The app will ask them things about their flight, their destination, their vaccination, and if they have any symptoms. And so that's all I really want to go over today officially, and we'll just do we can just do questions, I guess, because we don't have too many new news updates about any of the new pathways or anything, unfortunately.